Mary's story begins with a remarkable paradox. A princess destined for greatness, yet caught in a web of betrayal and conflict. Born as the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary was a princess from birth, with the title of heir apparent to the English throne. But her life would be anything but predictable. Raised in a time of immense political and religious upheaval, Mary's early life shaped her future in ways most people don't realize. You see, her father, Henry VIII, was a man of monumental ambition and desire for power. As we'll soon discover, his desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, set off a chain of events that would ultimately leave Mary caught in the middle. The tension started with her parents' marriage troubles. Henry's quest for a male heir led him to seek an annulment from Catherine, a decision that not only tore apart the royal family, but also split the very foundation of England's relationship with the Catholic Church. Henry's decision to break away from the Pope and create the Church of England would be the spark that would set the stage for Mary's turbulent reign. Mary was devastated by this. She had always been loyal to her Catholic faith, following the traditional beliefs of her mother. Yet her father's split with the Pope left her in a precarious position. As the daughter of a king who had rejected the Catholic faith and established a new church, Mary found herself not only politically vulnerable, but also spiritually isolated. There was a clear expectation that she, as the daughter of Henry and Catherine, would one day ascend to the throne. But her father's actions and his subsequent marriages cast a shadow over that future. Despite being the rightful heir to the throne, she was declared illegitimate and pushed aside in favor of her younger brother, Edward VI. This move would shape her for the rest of her life. Her deep sense of betrayal by her father is important. This emotional and political injustice would go on to fuel her determination to restore Catholicism to England, and eventually to claim the throne as her own. But was it all about religion, or was there something deeper? Was her drive to see her mother's faith restored simply a political mission, or was it an act of personal rebellion? The answer lies not only in her belief system, but in how that belief clashed with the very foundation of her kingdom. It's crucial to remember the role of religion in Mary's life. Raised Catholic, her faith was a constant in a time of growing tension between Catholicism and Protestantism. The Church of England had broken away from Rome, and England was now divided. The young princess, caught between two worlds, watched as the kingdom turned against the very faith she held dear. Could it be that this divided loyalty was the genesis of her later actions as queen? What if, in her mind, restoring Catholicism wasn't just about religion, but about restoring what was rightfully hers? There's something fascinating about Mary's commitment to her Catholic roots. It's often said that her decisions as queen were driven purely by a desire to restore Catholicism. But is that the full story? Was it just a matter of religious zeal, or was there something more at play? Something about her intense desire for legitimacy as a monarch, paired with the trauma of seeing her parents' marriage torn apart, seems to point to something deeper than just religious conviction. Here's where it gets even more intriguing. Many historians have debated whether Mary's actions were truly driven by faith, or by a deeper psychological need to assert her authority. The loss of her legitimacy, the abandonment by her father, and the shifting tides of power all created a dangerous mix. In her mind, she might have been fighting for her right to rule, not just her religion. It's easy to say that her actions were fueled by a burning desire to restore Catholicism, but was that all there was to it? Mary's constant battle for legitimacy as a Catholic monarch would come to define much of her reign. But it's important to ask, was this battle truly about faith, or was it something much more personal? A woman desperate to reclaim her place in a kingdom that had cast her aside, fighting not just for the throne, but for the recognition of her authority and the right to be seen as the legitimate ruler of England. And here's the controversial part. Could it be that Mary's violent actions weren't simply the result of a religious zealot, but of a woman deeply wounded by her own family's betrayal? Many historians have pointed out the personal nature of Mary's fight, and how her emotions, not just her faith, drove her decisions. Is it possible that Mary was less a religious martyr and more a monarch on a mission for personal redemption? You've heard the phrase Bloody Mary, but is that really the most accurate way to describe her? Or is it an oversimplification of a much more complex story? As we go deeper into her reign, you'll see that Mary's actions were far more complicated than we often hear. And what if the truth behind her decisions, driven not only by faith, but by a sense of personal justice, was the real source of her violent reign? But before we get to that, let's take a step back and look at the environment that shaped Mary's actions. What really turned her into the monarch history would remember for her ruthlessness? Was it simply her desire to restore Catholicism, or was there a deeper, darker force at play? This early conflict, the seeds of doubt sown during her childhood, would ultimately pave the way for her fierce and often bloody determination as queen. This foundational period of her life, filled with betrayal, frustration, and emotional turmoil, set the stage for the powerful actions she would take later. And as we move forward, you'll begin to understand how these early struggles shaped not just her faith, but her very sense of identity as a ruler. The mystery, the driving force behind her decisions, continues to unfold. What shaped Mary's later actions? Was it just a battle for religious restoration, or was there something more personal at stake? By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer understanding of why Mary I, Queen of England, became one of the most misunderstood and controversial monarchs in English history. How did the death of Mary's mother shape her path to the throne and influence her reign? Could this loss have been the driving force force behind her most infamous decisions? Mary the Faith and Catherine of Aragon was born into a kingdom divided by her father's dramatic break with the Catholic Church, but her real challenge began when her mother, Catherine, was discarded by Henry. This decision did not just have a political or personal impact on Mary, it marked the beginning of a fierce internal struggle that would shape her entire reign. Catherine of Aragon was more than just Mary's mother. She was her closest ally, her protector, and her link to a faith that Mary would later risk everything to restore. Mary's devotion to her mother was unquestionable. When Henry VIII annulled his marriage to Catherine, casting her aside in favor of Anne Boleyn, Mary was not just heartbroken, she was deeply shaken by the betrayal of her mother, her religion, and ultimately, her own identity as a princess. This traumatic event didn't just make Mary a symbol of political upheaval, it set the stage for her determination to become the queen she believed she was destined to be. At a young age, Mary found herself in the midst of a storm she had no control over. Her father's political maneuvering left her declared illegitimate, and her status as heir to the throne was stripped away. No longer recognized as the legitimate successor, Mary faced not only political isolation but a deep sense of betrayal. Her personal and religious identity were under attack, and as she watched her father consolidate power, her resentment grew. But this wasn't just a political struggle, it was deeply personal. Mary believed, as did her mother, that the Catholic faith was essential to England's stability and her own legitimacy. Yet the country around her was changing. As Mary's faith in Catholicism deepened, her battle for legitimacy intensified. She was born into a world where power and religion were intertwined, and it became clear to her that her mother's faith and her own beliefs would be vital to her future. After all, how could a Catholic princess like Mary accept the actions of her father and the rise of Protestantism? She grew determined to restore England to what she saw as its rightful Catholic state. But was this driven by an intense belief in her faith, or was there something deeper, something far more personal and raw? Mary's reaction to her mother's death reveals a fierce determination that was cultivated through years of emotional torment. As we'll explore, her mother's death didn't just drive Mary to restore Catholicism, it became an obsession. The trauma of being cast aside by her father and the loss of her mother would fuel a reign defined by drastic action. But as we go deeper into her story, we'll explore how that personal grief merged with her political ambitions, and whether her efforts to restore Catholicism were rooted in faith or in something more. Could it be that Mary's crusade was not only about religion, but about claiming a place for herself in a kingdom that had so ruthlessly tried to erase her? This is where the conflict begins. Was Mary's rise to power truly an act of faith, or was it a battle to regain her rightful position? To understand this, we must consider what happened when her mother died in 1536, during one of the most tumultuous periods in English history. At this point, Mary's claim to the throne had been usurped by her brother Edward VI, and she had already been denied legitimacy by her father. Without her mother's influence, Mary was isolated in a world that no longer recognized her as the rightful heir. But despite this, her love for her mother and her adherence to Catholicism would not be shaken. Instead, it would become a defining feature of her reign. Mary's determination to restore the Catholic faith was rooted in a personal vendetta, but also in a deeply political context. England was in the midst of a religious transformation, and Mary was watching as Protestantism spread across the nation. What she saw as a betrayal of her mother's legacy was also a betrayal of her faith. But was this conflict really about religion, or was it more about Mary's desire to regain her place in a world that had turned its back on her? Here's where things get even more interesting. Was Mary's reign truly about religious zealotry, or was it also driven by her desperation for power and recognition? The question isn't just whether she wanted to restore Catholicism, but whether she was willing to sacrifice everything: human lives, personal integrity, and even her legacy to do so. This is where Mary's reign begins to blur the lines between politics and personal vengeance. Did she truly believe in the divine right of kings and queens to rule by the will of God, or was she simply a woman determined to reclaim what was rightfully hers? What makes Mary's reign so fascinating is that we don't really know the full extent of her motivations. Historians continue to argue whether Mary's actions were solely the result of her belief in Catholicism, or whether personal ambition and emotional scars played a more significant role. What we can be certain of, however, is that Mary's fight for legitimacy was more than just a political battle. It was a battle that intertwined religion, personal grief, and the pursuit of a throne that had been taken from her. The loss of Catherine of Aragon, a queen beloved by many, was more than just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a struggle for identity that would last the rest of Mary's life. In trying to restore Catholicism, Mary was attempting to restore not just the faith, but also the place she had lost within her family and the monarchy. The question remains, was her devotion to Catholicism truly about faith, or was it about something far more personal, her own sense of self and power? As we continue, we'll explore the psychological and emotional toll of these events on Mary. How did this early loss shape her reign? What were the consequences of this deeply personal experience for her decisions as queen? How did it push her to become one of the most infamous monarchs in English history? The answers to these questions will help us understand why Mary I, often remembered for her brutal policies and violent actions, was also a woman who faced a kingdom that had shattered her identity and a family that had forsaken forsaken her. By the end of this section, you'll have a better understanding of how the death of Catherine of Aragon pushed Mary into a series of decisions that would ultimately define her reign. But we're only scratching the surface. What's next in her story is even more revealing as we dive deeper into how this early loss set the stage for her relationship with the throne. Stay tuned, because what we'll uncover next could change everything you thought you knew about Bloody Mary. Was Philip's marriage to Mary a political move, or was there more to it? When Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain in 1554, the union sparked controversy that would reverberate throughout England for years to come. On the surface, it seemed like a strategic move, one that could unite two powerful Catholic nations. But the reality behind this marriage is far more complex. Was it really just politics, or was there something deeper at play? Something that would go on to shape the very course of Mary's reign. Mary, deeply Catholic and desperate to restore the faith she believed England had lost, was eager for an alliance that could strengthen her position and provide support for her religious policies. Philip, the son of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was also deeply Catholic and a natural ally in Mary's quest to undo the Protestant reforms of her father, Henry VIII. But despite this seemingly perfect match, the marriage was fraught with tension from the very start. For one, Philip was not universally beloved in England. As a foreign monarch, his presence was met with suspicion and hostility by many of the English people. It didn't help that Philip was married to Mary not for love, but for political reasons. To make matters worse, many feared that the marriage would undermine English sovereignty. The idea of a foreign king having any influence over England was a bitter pill to swallow for the English nobility, who worried about their own power being overshadowed. But what's particularly interesting about this marriage is the personal cost it had for Mary. Despite her determination to marry Philip, she had no real support from her people. The English, struggling with the recent political and religious upheavals, were suspicious of a foreign ruler and didn't understand why their queen would marry a man they saw as a stranger to their way of life. The marriage, seen as an imposition by foreign powers, intensified the divisions already tearing England apart. In the eyes of the English public, this wasn't just a queen trying to unite two Catholic powers. It was a queen who was willing to compromise her nation for the sake of her own beliefs. Here's where things get even more complicated. The marriage had political ramifications that went beyond Mary's religious zeal. It was also about power, not just religion. Despite Philip's support for Mary's Catholic ambitions, he had no real intention of ruling England as his own. He spent little time in England, and his absence from the kingdom only made the people more resentful. It wasn't just a political arrangement, it was a reminder that Mary's reign, already fragile due to her gender and her Catholic views, was now also marked by an unpopular foreign marriage. The relationship between Mary and Philip is often portrayed as cold and distant, and history has suggested that it lacked the warmth and affection one might expect from a royal marriage. The fact that they never had a child together added another layer of tragedy to an already strained union. Mary, desperate to produce a Catholic heir to the throne, clung to the hope that this marriage would restore England's Catholic identity. But her failure to conceive only exacerbated her personal and political struggles. It raised doubts about her reign and added fuel to the fire of dissent against her rule. This lack of an heir left England in a precarious position. The marriage had promised a solution to England's religious division, but it only deepened the crisis. Philip, though a devout Catholic, was never truly accepted by the English. His refusal to fully engage in the English court only made matters worse. Many believed that Mary's marriage to Philip was not only an expression of her faith, but also a sign of her desperation, a queen who would do anything to secure her position and that of Catholicism in England. In fact, the pressure of the marriage to Philip and the failure to produce a child left a lasting impact on Mary's reign. Her paranoia grew, and she became increasingly fearful that her legitimacy would be questioned by those around her. She faced constant challenges to her rule, both from within the kingdom and from external forces, and her reliance on Philip only made her feel more isolated. This sense of isolation led Mary to some of the most controversial decisions of her reign, decisions that would define her legacy as Bloody Mary. Let's take a moment to consider how strange it is that the very marriage that was supposed to bolster her reign ultimately created even more tension and conflict. Philip's absence from England, the lack of affection between them, and the failure to produce an heir all added up to a marriage that seemed doomed from the start. Was this truly a strategic move on Mary's part, or was it a sign of a deeper need for validation? Validation that she never fully received, even from her own husband. But here's the question that still lingers. Did the marriage to Philip reveal Mary's weakness, or did it demonstrate her resolve? Was her willingness to marry a foreign prince a sign of desperation, or did it show a decommitment to her cause, restoring Catholicism in England at all costs? Mary's relationship with Philip, though politically significant, was a tragic one in many ways. It forced Mary into a position where her power was always questioned. A foreign king, her unfulfilled hopes for an heir, and the growing unrest in England turned a political marriage into a symbol of a queen's isolation. By the time Mary's reign ended, she had never truly experienced the support she had hoped for. What's perhaps the most fascinating and controversial about this marriage is how it seems to embody the contradictions in Mary's reign. Her determination to restore Catholicism was unwavering, but the cost of that restoration, both politically and personally, was was immense. Her reliance on Philip II was part of a larger strategy, but it also made her more vulnerable. Could Mary have been more successful without this foreign alliance, or did it ultimately seal her fate? As we continue, we'll explore the deeper layers of Mary's reign and how her marriage to Philip II fits into the larger picture of her tumultuous rule. Was it a mere political move, or was there something more complex at work in this royal union? What can we learn from Mary's struggles in this marriage, and how did it shape the decisions she made as queen? Stay with us, because the answers might surprise you as we delve further into the dark side of Mary's reign. Was Mary's persecution of Protestants truly about religion, or was there more to it? Mary's reign is remembered for the bloodshed that followed her commitment to restore Catholicism in a country that had been torn apart by her father's break with Rome. Known for the brutal executions of Protestant reformers, her violent policies are often seen as the hallmark of her reign. But was it solely about her faith, or was there a much deeper, more complex reason behind her actions? At the heart of this question is the political and personal turmoil Mary faced when she ascended to the throne. Her legitimacy had been contested for years, and now, as the first queen regnant of England, she was under constant threat. The country was deeply divided, and religious conflict was not just a matter of belief, it was a matter of power. Was her persecution of Protestants simply the result of a deeply held religious belief, or was it a calculated attempt to solidify her authority, reclaim her throne, and punish those who had once rejected her? Mary's determination to restore Catholicism can't be understood in isolation. For one, the Protestant Reformation was sweeping through Europe, causing a dramatic shift in religious practices. England, under the rule of her father, had severed its ties with the Pope and adopted Protestantism. Now, as Queen, Mary sought to reverse this, believing that it was not only the rightful return to the true faith, but also a way to heal a divided England. But what was she really hoping to accomplish? Was this just a religious mission, or something more personal? Here's a strange fact. Historians have suggested that Mary may have viewed the persecution of Protestants as a necessary step to unify her country, even if it meant resorting to violence. For Mary, Catholicism was not just a religion, it was a political tool. Restoring the faith meant restoring her legitimacy, both in the eyes of God and her people. Her actions, often described as religious zeal, were in many ways a reaction to the constant question of her legitimacy and her intense desire to solidify her rule. The harsh measures she took against Protestant reformers were a desperate attempt to show that she and Catholicism were the rightful authority in England. But here's the twist. Many believe that her persecution of Protestants wasn't only driven by religious conviction. Some argue it was a manifestation of her fear and desperation. She had seen her parents' marriage torn apart, her mother cast aside, and her own legitimacy questioned. Her actions were as much about reclaiming her place on the throne as they were about faith. Could it be that Mary's actions were less about theological conviction and more about her desire for power? Could she have been so consumed by the need to restore her status that religion became the convenient excuse for her violent purges? Let's take a closer look at the events that shaped her reign. When Mary assumed the throne, she was already a queen in a deeply fractured country. Her father, Henry VIII, had declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, leading to the country's break from the Catholic Church. By the time Mary ascended, Protestantism had firmly taken root in England. The idea of restoring Catholicism was not simply about returning to religious traditions. It was about undoing her father's legacy and reasserting her own authority. Her decision to persecute Protestants was in part a symbolic act of reclaiming what had been lost during her father's reign. But here's something even more controversial. Historians argue that her actions were not only about religious fervor, but also about control. Mary was a woman in a time when female rulers were often viewed with suspicion. She faced constant threats to her power, both from within her court and from Protestant factions outside. Her violent actions against Protestants were, in many ways, a response to the threats she felt against her throne. This wasn't just about faith. It was about Mary proving her strength as a ruler and showing that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect her reign. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Mary's reign was not as much about protecting Catholicism as it was about securing her own power. Her violent crackdown on Protestants was a statement, a way to show that she was not to be challenged. The execution of prominent Protestant reformers became a tool for political consolidation, and though it was framed as a religious war, it was equally a way for Mary to silence those who opposed her. What we often forget about Mary's persecution of Protestants is that it wasn't just about faith, it was a fight for survival as a monarch. Was this religious persecution, or was it a woman's battle to assert herself in a kingdom that was constantly trying to undermine her? Now, let's discuss something that might surprise you. Most of the executions during Mary's reign were not the bloodbaths that they are often described as. Yes, there were executions, and they were brutal, but they were not as widespread as many believe. The most infamous part of the Marian persecutions was the burning of prominent Protestant leaders, but the overall number of executions was far smaller than the myth suggests. Historians have noted that the number of Protestants killed during her reign was much lower than the large-scale purges seen in other parts of Europe. The legend of Mary as Bloody Mary has, in many ways, been exaggerated, and it is important to remember that these executions were highly politicized acts, not just religious zealotry. And yet, this Bloody Mary image stuck. It was fueled by Protestant propagandists who wanted to demonize her as a bloodthirsty queen. The public image of Mary as a murderous monarch was shaped by her enemies, and much of the popular history of her reign is built around these exaggerated portrayals. While it is true that Mary executed many prominent Protestants, the reasons behind these actions were not purely religious. The political climate, her struggle for power, and the constant threat to her reign all played a crucial role in shaping her policies. The persecution of Protestants was as much about Mary's survival as it was about religious convictions. This leaves us with an uncomfortable but compelling question. Was Mary a religious zealot, or a monarch who used religion as a tool to secure her throne? The truth lies somewhere in between. The reality of her reign is much more complex than the Bloody Mary myth suggests. It's easy to cast Mary as a villain, but when we look deeper, we see a woman who was fighting for her rightful place in a kingdom that had cast her aside. A woman who was willing to do whatever it took to restore both her faith and her rule. In the next sections, we'll explore the personal and political factors that drove Mary's decisions, as well as how the aftermath of her reign affected her legacy. But for now, let's leave you with this. The persecution of Protestants during Mary's reign may have been as much about power as it was about religion, and the Bloody Mary we remember today may not be the full story. How did Mary become known as Bloody Mary, and is the name justified? The name Bloody Mary is one that strikes fear in many, conjuring images of a merciless queen who killed indiscriminately in the name of religion. But is that the true story of Mary I, or has history distorted her reign into something darker than it actually was? Mary I's reputation as Bloody Mary is deeply entrenched in the public consciousness, and for good reason. Her reign, which lasted from 1553 to 1558, was marked by the execution of hundreds of Protestants, many of them burned at the stake. Her reign, in fact, became infamous for the Marian persecutions, a series of brutal punishments aimed at restoring Catholicism in England. These executions and tortures were so gruesome that they earned her the title Bloody Mary. But what if this legend is based on only part of the truth? What if there's more to her reign than just religious zealotry and executions? Could it be that Bloody Mary has been misrepresented by history, or was she truly as ruthless as she is often made out to be? First, let's set the record straight. Mary's reign was undoubtedly brutal, but it's important to note that the actual number of executions during her time in power has been grossly exaggerated. Most estimates place the number of those executed during her reign at around 280, a far cry from the thousands that the popular myth suggests. But this doesn't negate the fear and terror she spread across England during her short reign. The shocking part of Mary's rule was the manner in which her government dealt with religious dissent. The executions were public, often conducted in front of large crowds, and many of the people burned at the stake were not just anyone. They were scholars, clergymen, and leaders of the Protestant Reformation in England. But here's where it gets interesting. The real story behind her actions might surprise you. While it's true that Mary was deeply committed to Catholicism, many historians suggest that the persecutions weren't solely about her religious beliefs. They were also political. In fact, many of the executions were targeted not just at Protestants, but at anyone who might challenge Mary's authority. Religious persecution in this context also served as a tool to suppress potential threats to her throne. Here's a strange fact. At the time, England was not just divided religiously, but politically. The Protestant Reformation had already taken hold under Henry VIII and Edward VI, and by the time Mary ascended to the throne, much of her country had already been converted to Protestantism. To Mary, this wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was an existential threat to her reign. By purging Protestant leaders, Mary hoped not only to restore Catholicism, but also to reassert her power as the rightful Queen of England. In this light, her reign can be seen as both a religious and a political struggle for legitimacy. But there's another layer to consider. Mary's image as Bloody Mary was largely shaped by her enemies, Protestant propagandists who sought to tarnish her reputation. The term Bloody Mary was coined by those who saw her as a tyrant, a queen who sought to crush any dissent with violence. It was easy for her enemies to paint her as a villain, especially considering that much of her persecution focused on burning religious leaders at the stake, and these images of public executions and gruesome punishments formed the core of her bloody legacy. The question now becomes, was Mary truly a bloodthirsty queen, or was she a ruler in a much more precarious position than we give her credit for? Some argue that she was simply a product of her time, a monarch who felt she had no choice but to act decisively in a kingdom that was hostile to her rule. Could Mary have been driven more by fear and insecurity than by the desire for religious purity? Her early years, marked by the threat to her legitimacy, likely fueled her need to prove herself, both as a monarch and as a defender of the faith. This drove her to make harsh decisions, but not necessarily out of a desire to slaughter for the sake of religion. Another interesting point to consider is how Mary's violent actions were politically motivated. Mary's claim to the throne was weak, and after years of being declared illegitimate by her father's actions and those of her brother, she needed to consolidate her power. The rise of Protestantism not only threatened her Catholic beliefs, but also presented a challenge to her very right to rule. By targeting Protestants, who were the leaders of the religious revolution in England, Mary was simultaneously attacking the political enemies who stood in the way of her reign. It was a calculated move that, in her eyes, was necessary to stabilize her kingdom and secure her throne. Now let's turn to the impact of these actions. How did Mary's reign reign shaped the narrative that we associate with her today. The historical image of Mary as Bloody Mary is not just the product of her actions, but of the way those actions were portrayed by her enemies. Propaganda and storytelling played a crucial role in shaping the public perception of her. The persecution of Protestants, particularly the public executions, became a symbol of her cruelty in the eyes of her Protestant opponents. But did Mary view her actions as cruel? Some historians believe that Mary saw herself as a defender of the true faith, someone who was saving her country from the heretical Protestant influence. Was her violence justified in her eyes? Mary likely believed that she was doing the right thing, not just for herself, but for England and for the Catholic Church. She was, in her mind, a martyr for her faith, trying to reverse the damage done by her father's schism with the Catholic Church. In reality, Mary's reign was more complex than just a campaign of bloodshed. Her rule was marked by internal struggles, political upheaval, and religious conflict. The Bloody Mary image has often overshadowed the more complicated aspects of her reign. Yes, Mary was responsible for executions, but she was also a queen caught between conflicting forces, religious fervor, political necessity, and the constant threat to her legitimacy. The real story behind her reign is far more nuanced than the bloodthirsty queen legend suggests. So, is the Bloody Mary label justified? While Mary's reign was undoubtedly marked by violence, it's important to view her actions within the context of the time. Was she a tyrant, or was she a queen trying to restore order and reclaim her kingdom in the face of overwhelming odds? Truth is more complicated than the label suggests, and understanding her reign requires more than just a glance at the public executions. Mary's legacy, like many historical figures, is shaped by the way history chooses to remember her. But the real story of Mary's reign is one that goes beyond the bloodshed, one that reveals a woman struggling to restore not just religion, but her rightful place as queen. Was Mary's violence a response to threats against her rule? Anne of England's reign was plagued by rebellion and unrest, but what if the bloodshed she became infamous for was not just the result of religious fervor, but also an attempt to defend her throne against the forces that sought to topple her? When Mary ascended to the throne in 1553, she inherited a country in turmoil. Her claim to the throne was fragile at best, and she knew that her rule was threatened both by external enemies and internal factions. The Protestant Reformation had already begun to take hold in England under her father, Henry VIII, and her brother, Edward VI. Mary, a staunch Catholic, was now facing a divided country that had moved away from the papacy. Her very legitimacy was questioned by those who didn't see her as the rightful monarch. This environment of distrust and division would shape much of her reign, and it's one of the key factors that led to the violence that has marked her historical legacy. Here's the strange fact. While most people associate Mary's violence with her Catholic faith and the Marian persecutions, the truth is that much of the bloodshed during her reign was sparked by rebellion and political unrest, not just religious differences. One of the most infamous examples was Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, which directly challenged her rule. The rebellion was sparked by several factors, not just her marriage to Philip II of Spain, but also by the instability of her reign. Wyatt's rebellion wasn't just a religious uprising, it was a direct challenge to her legitimacy as queen. And for Mary, who had already seen the destruction of her parents' marriage and the divisiveness of her father's actions, the fear of losing the throne to such uprisings was real. The rebellion created a moment of crisis, one that forced Mary to act swiftly and harshly. The rebels were crushed, and many of them were executed in the aftermath. But it wasn't just religious opponents who were executed during Mary's reign. It was anyone who posed a threat to her crown. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was Mary's violence truly about faith, or was it a political necessity to preserve her throne? Was the fear of rebellion the driving force behind the brutality of her reign? Then, let's pause for a moment and explore the nature of the rebellions that occurred during Mary's reign. It's often said that rebellion is a cry for freedom, but for Mary, rebellion was a threat to her very survival. Her enemies, particularly Protestant reformers, were already vocal in their opposition to her rule. They saw her as a return to an old and oppressive way of life, but Mary saw them as insurrectionists, people who were not only challenging her religion, but also trying to strip her of the authority she had fought so hard to secure. These rebellions made her feel as though her throne was always under siege, and the violence that followed was her way of defending that throne. Here's an interesting point. Mary's decision to execute those who opposed her wasn't just about religious purity, it was about consolidating her power. During her reign, she faced constant challenges, both from within her court and from outside forces. Her marriage to Philip II, a Spanish king, further alienated her from many in England who were suspicious of foreign influence. These political and religious tensions bred instability, and Mary responded by using violence as a tool of control. But here's the controversial truth. Some historians argue that Mary's violent actions weren't just a reaction to external threat. Rather, they were a reflection of her internal fears and insecurities. Her desire to restore Catholicism and reverse the Reformation wasn't just about saving the soul of England, it was also about saving her own rule. Her efforts to persecute Protestants and quash rebellion were, in a sense, an attempt to secure her place as queen, proving to herself and her enemies that she would not be easily overthrown. Could Mary have ruled peacefully if she had not felt such constant threats to her reign? The rebellions of her time weren't isolated incidents. They were symptomatic of the larger political instability that characterized her reign. It wasn't just one rebellion. There were numerous threats to Mary's authority. In fact, after the death of her beloved father Henry VIII, England had become a nation deeply divided over its religious identity. By the time Mary became queen, England was a Protestant nation, and her Catholic views made her an outsider to many of her subjects. This sense of alienation pushed Mary to take extreme measures. The Marian persecutions were not just about religious conviction, they were about establishing control. It's essential to understand that Mary's violence was as much about survival as it was about religion. The political unrest during her reign was driven by the challenges to her authority, and Mary's response was shaped by her need to assert herself as a strong monarch in a turbulent time. There's a controversial question here. Was Mary's reign defined by violence because of her deep Catholic faith, or was it because she was a queen trying desperately to hold on to her crown? Strangely, many historians point out that her reign might have been different if Mary had faced less political and religious opposition. If England had been united behind her from the start, perhaps her reign would not have been as bloody. But the reality was that Mary inherited a divided country, and the constant threat of rebellion, combined with her own insecurities, led her to become the ruthless monarch history remembers. So, was Mary's violence solely a response to threats against her rule, or was it the result of a combination of political necessity and deep fear? The truth, as always, is complex. While her persecution of Protestants was undoubtedly rooted in her religious beliefs, it was also tied to her desire to consolidate power and maintain control. Her violent actions were both a defense against rebellion and a way to reaffirm her authority as a queen in a male-dominated world. As we continue, we will dive deeper into the political challenges Mary faced and explore how her fear of losing the throne ultimately shaped her decisions. Was Mary simply a product of her time, or did she make choices that sealed her legacy as one of England's most controversial monarchs? Stay with us, because we are about to explore how the fear of rebellion, combined with Mary's own personal struggles, led her down a violent path. How did the Marian persecutions shape her legacy, and were they the result of personal conviction? Mary's decision to execute hundreds of Protestants during her reign has been one of the defining features of her legacy. To many, she is forever etched in history as Bloody Mary. But was this truly a religious act, or was there more at play? The Marian persecutions are infamous, but the story behind them is more complicated than it seems. In total, around 300 Protestants were executed during Mary's reign, most of them burned at the stake for heresy. Yet these actions were not just about restoring Catholicism to England. There was a deep political and personal element to her decisions. To understand Mary's motives, we need to consider the pressures she faced and the climate of fear and division in England at the time. Here's a strange fact. Many of the people executed weren't even radical Protestants, but rather ordinary men and women caught in the turmoil of a country at war with itself over religion. It wasn't always clear whether these were acts of religious zeal or acts of political necessity. When Mary ordered the executions, it wasn't simply about the faith, it was about power. She needed to send a message to her subjects that anyone who opposed her, especially those who threatened her rule, would be silenced. Mary's devotion to Catholicism was genuine, but so was her fear of losing control. After years of instability and the trauma of seeing her family torn apart by religious conflict, she was determined to restore order. But could her need for control have gone too far? Many historians argue that Mary's actions were more political than religious. She was desperately trying to reaffirm her authority in a kingdom that had rejected her father's Catholicism and embraced the Protestant Reformation. The idea of reclaiming Catholicism was deeply tied to her belief in divine right, the idea that her monarchy was sanctioned by God. Yet her pursuit of religious unity came at a heavy cost. Did she really believe in the religious aspect of her persecution, or was it a way for her to prove her strength in a time when she had so little power? Here's where it gets controversial. Some scholars argue that the Marian persecutions were as much about restoring political stability as they were about religious purity. The executions were not just about punishing heretics, they were about asserting control over a kingdom still in upheaval. If she could rid the nation of those who didn't share her faith, she could remove a significant portion of the opposition to her rule. But did this achieve the goal of stability? The truth is more complex. While Mary may have hoped that the executions would solidify her position, they only deepened the divisions within England. Her efforts to quell dissent were viewed by many as tyrannical, and the executions only fueled the perception that Mary was a ruthless monarch. What's more, the executions were seen by many as a direct contradiction to her claim that she was restoring peace. Her reign, defined by these bloody acts, left an indelible stain on her legacy. To this day, many still remember her as Bloody Mary, a queen whose reign was defined by religious violence and oppression. But let's step back for a moment. Could Mary have ruled differently? Could there have been another way to restore Catholicism without resorting to violence? Some historians argue that she was caught in a trap of history, forced to choose between extreme measures and losing the throne. The fear of rebellion, the threat of being overthrown, and the intense pressure to restore her religious beliefs shaped Mary's decisions. Her actions were a response to the overwhelming weight of history pressing down on her, a young queen fighting to make her mark in a deeply divided kingdom. But there's another layer to this story, the role of propaganda. Mary's enemies, particularly Protestant writers, worked tirelessly to shape her image as a bloodthirsty tyrant. The term Bloody Mary didn't just emerge out of nowhere. The executions, though gruesome, were part of a broader political narrative. The result, Mary's reputation was tarnished for centuries. She became a symbol of religious intolerance, and much of the nuance of her reign was lost in the political discourse of the time. The real story behind the Marian persecutions is far more complicated than a simple religious crusade. The fact is that the persecutions were deeply entwined with political power. They were not only about restoring Catholicism, but also about controlling the narrative of England's future. Mary's violence was a tool of both faith and politics, a means of asserting her rule over a fractured kingdom. At the end of the day, Mary's actions were driven by a profound fear of losing her place in history. She saw herself as the rightful heir to the throne, and in her eyes, restoring Catholicism was part of her duty to God and her country. But the question remains, did she cross a line? Was the violence of the Marian persecutions truly justified, or did it ultimately undermine her legacy? The Marian persecutions defined much of Mary's reign, but in the grand sweep of history, they are not the only aspect of her rule. As we continue to explore her life, we'll see how this violent chapter fits into a broader picture of a monarch who, despite her best intentions, left a legacy that has been debated for centuries. Could Mary have been remembered differently if her reign had been less violent? What if history had seen her as a queen who fought for religious unity, not as a tyrant bent on crushing opposition? These are the questions we'll explore as we continue to unravel the story of Bloody Mary. Did Mary's personal struggles contribute to her decisions as queen? Mary's quest for a Catholic heir was not just a political necessity, it was a deeply personal desire. Her greatest frustration lay in her inability to have a child with Philip II, the man she married to strengthen the Catholic cause. She was obsessed with having a son, not only to ensure the survival of Catholicism in England, but also to provide a sense of legitimacy to her reign. Without an heir, Mary's rule was constantly under threat. The failure to produce a child, especially a male heir, added an emotional and political strain that ultimately affected her decisions as monarch. Here's a strange fact. At one point, the English court believed that Mary was pregnant. After months of anticipation, rumors of a royal baby filled the air. The entire nation awaited the birth of what they hoped would be a prince. However, when nothing came of it, the hope for a Catholic heir vanished. The royal court and the people were left shocked and confused. This episode, known as the false pregnancy, was not just a personal disappointment for Mary, but a public humiliation that hurt her reputation. Many began to question her ability to rule, and this failure exacerbated the tension and fear surrounding her reign. Now consider this. Despite her repeated failures to conceive, some of Mary's closest allies and advisors still maintained hope. Why? Because her reign, built on such fragile legitimacy, was tied to the idea that a Catholic heir would cement her authority. It's hard to overstate how significant this was, not just for Mary personally, but for the future of England itself. Without an heir, her death would mean a Protestant successor, a nightmare for the Catholic cause she fought so hard to preserve. But was it only the fear of losing the throne that drove her to make certain decisions, or was there something deeper at play? The pressure mounted, and it began to show. The desperation to produce a child took a toll on Mary's health, both physically and emotionally. Her frustration grew as her body seemed to betray her. This led to a growing sense of paranoia. Some historians argue that Mary's struggles with childlessness contributed to her later decisions, especially the brutality of her reign. If her failure to conceive had not deeply affected her, would she have resorted to the extreme measures she took against the Protestants? Did the intense pressure to restore Catholicism and secure the throne cloud her judgment? Here's a controversial thought. Some scholars believe that Mary's obsession with childbirth may have been less about faith and more about power. It was an act of desperation to preserve her reign, not necessarily to fulfill a spiritual or national mission. If this is true, then Mary's actions, from the violent religious persecutions to the ruthless crackdown on dissent, could have been driven by fear and insecurity, rather than a strong religious conviction. Could her childlessness have made her more dangerous as a monarch? Without a male heir to secure her dynasty, Mary felt as though the only way to solidify her Catholic restoration was to take drastic actions. She executed hundreds of Protestants in what came to be known as the Marian persecutions. Was this the action of a queen devoted to her faith, or was it the action of a desperate monarch determined to preserve her claim to the throne? But let's consider another rare fact. While history often focuses on Mary's frustration over her inability to have a child, there's another side to her story. It's rarely mentioned, but Mary had several miscarriages throughout her marriage to Philip. Some historians believe these failed pregnancies may have further broken her resolve. Her body's inability to provide the heir she needed led to both physical and emotional turmoil. The disappointment wasn't just personal, it was political. As each failure mounted, Mary's grip on her throne grew weaker. The court was already skeptical of her, and without an heir, her reign seemed destined to end in failure. What's fascinating is the way Mary's personal struggles intersected with the broader religious and political conflicts of her time. Every miscarriage was more than just a personal loss. It was a national crisis. Her inability to conceive a child meant that the Protestant faction in England gained more influence. Each failed pregnancy was a small but significant defeat in her battle to maintain Catholic power in a Protestant-dominated society. This left Mary with two pressing intertwined problems: securing her Catholic legacy legacy and finding a way to maintain her rule. But imagine this. What if Mary had been able to produce a child? Why? Would the history of England and Europe have been different? Could she have avoided the religious wars and the violence that marked the latter part of her reign? The inability to fulfill what was seen as her natural role as a queen, to provide an heir, left her vulnerable and isolated. This vulnerability drove many of the choices that defined her reign. In conclusion, while Mary's struggles with childlessness were personal, they played a significant role in shaping her reign. The absence of a Catholic heir caused her to make decisions that were as much about survival as they were about faith. These personal and political tensions intertwined, leading to one of the bloodiest periods in England's history. But what if, just once, her hopes had been realized? What if the court had celebrated the birth of a child, securing her legacy? History have remembered Mary differently? The answer to that question may never be known, but what we can be sure of is that Mary's childlessness became a cornerstone of her reign, influencing both her personal decisions and her political actions. Was Mary's failure in France the final blow to her reign? Mary's dream of restoring England's glory had always been tied to its lost territories in France. Calais, England's last stronghold in France, was a humiliating blow to Mary's ambitions. Imagine for a moment the disappointment she must have felt. Here was a monarch determined to reclaim the past glory of her kingdom, and yet this final defeat marked the end of an era. For over 200 years, Calais had been a symbol of England's power in France, and Mary's failure to defend it tarnished both her reign and the crown's legacy. What most people don't know is that the loss of Calais had an immediate psychological effect on Mary's rule. It wasn't just the loss of land, it was the loss of something symbolic. Calais was not merely a military stronghold, it was a symbol of England's once unshakable influence in Europe. Losing it to France meant that Mary's aspirations to restore Catholicism through political and military might would never be realized. It was, in a sense, the final crushing blow to her reputation as a powerful ruler capable of restoring the glory of the English monarchy. But here's the twist. Was the loss of Calais truly the end of her reign, or did it only accelerate the inevitable? You might think that such a loss would force Mary to reconsider her strategies, but rather than retreat, she doubled down. The political instability in England during this time, compounded by the loss of Calais, made her rule even more precarious. Did she see this as her last chance to secure a legacy, or was the loss of France simply the final signal that her dreams of greatness were slipping through her fingers? Let's consider a rare fact. Although the loss of Calais occurred during her reign, it wasn't entirely her fault. Mary's efforts to reclaim the territory were hampered by a lack of resources, poor military strategies, and the constant threat of rebellion at home. In fact, some historians argue that if Mary had had a stronger military or more allies, the loss could have been avoided. But was it simply a case of bad timing and bad luck, or did the political climate in England, filled with religious strife and foreign threats, make the loss inevitable? Here's a controversial thought. Was the loss of Calais not just the failure of a queen, but the culmination of a nation's misplaced priorities? Mary's rule was filled with religious wars and a desperate attempt to restore Catholicism. Yet England was severely underprepared to face the growing strength of France. Instead of focusing on military reform or diplomacy, Mary continued to focus on the religious conflicts tearing England apart. Could her obsession with religion have distracted her from the very real political and military needs of the crown? What's fascinating is that, in a way, the loss of Calais also symbolized Mary's internal conflict, her desire to restore Catholicism and her fear of losing control. She had the chance to forge a new path for England, one that didn't revolve around the failed policies of her father, Henry VIII. But the loss of Calais made it clear that Mary was not in control of her own fate. It was as if the weight of history had come crashing down on her, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't rewrite it. The loss of Calais, however, didn't just mark a physical defeat. It was a metaphor for the failing of Mary's reign. Her dream of restoring England to its former power had always been tied to external victories, but with the loss of France, it became clear that her reign was defined by internal struggles. Religious conflict, rebellion, and personal tragedy had all shaped her actions, and the loss of Calais symbolized that no matter how much she fought, she could never regain what had been lost, both the land and the respect of her people. And let's pause here. How did this single loss shape the rest of her reign? Did it lead to a turning point where Mary realized her power was waning? The answer is not straightforward. After the loss of Calais, the political atmosphere in England became even more volatile. Despite her desperate attempts to reassert control, many viewed her as a failed monarch, unable to secure England's position in Europe. Her attempts to revive Catholicism only deepened the divide between her supporters and her enemies. The loss of Calais was not the cause of her downfall, but it certainly sealed the fate of her legacy. By the time she died, Mary's hopes of restoring England's Catholic roots had crumbled. She had failed in her military ambitions, and her efforts to secure a legacy through violence and persecution had left the country divided. But did her failure in France play a role in this? Was the loss of Calais the tipping point that led to the collapse of her vision for England's future? It's a tough question to answer, but one thing is clear. The loss of France marked the beginning of the end for Mary's reign. While she remained queen for a few more years, the hope of restoring England to its former glory through foreign victories was gone. The fact that Mary, who had dreamed of reclaiming lost territories, couldn't even hold on on to her last stronghold shows just how fragile her reign was. And here's the ultimate paradox. In trying to fight for England's greatness through military conquest, Mary only deepened the rift between herself and her people. What would have happened if she had focused on strengthening her domestic rule rather than pursuing the seemingly impossible foreign dream? Would Mary have been able to solidify her reign and leave a more lasting legacy? It's a question that history has yet to fully answer. But in the end, Mary's reign, marked by her obsession with restoring the Catholic faith and her desire to regain lost territories, was defined by a series of unfortunate events. The loss of Calais symbolized the end of her hopes, but it also marked the end of an era in England's history. Can we separate the legend of Bloody Mary from the real woman who ruled? When we hear the name Bloody Mary, most of us immediately think of a ruthless queen who bathed England in blood during her reign. But is that the full story? The name Bloody Mary was coined during a time when the Protestants who opposed her rule were at their strongest. However, the truth is far more complicated than the simple, one-dimensional image that this nickname evoked. Historians have long debated whether Mary's actions were justified or simply the result of a cruel and power-hungry monarch. What's fascinating is that much of her bloody reputation comes from her enemies, those who were trying to survive in the wake of her persecution. But what if, instead of a cold-hearted tyrant, Mary was actually a woman caught in an impossible situation, fighting not only for her throne but for her vision of England's future? Some claim that Mary's reign was driven by the desire to restore Catholicism and prevent what she saw as a dangerous Protestant rise in England. But was she justified in her actions? Her violent decisions, including the Marian persecutions, were seen as attempts to bring England back under the control of the Catholic Church. She believed that the religious division that split her country was not only dangerous but could doom England. However, here's where things get controversial. Did Mary genuinely act out of faith, or was she, at some point, driven by something more, perhaps a desperation to secure her reign and legacy? What's rare about Mary's story is that her reign was the culmination of centuries of religious and political instability. Her father, Henry VIII, set the stage for a divided kingdom when he broke with the Catholic Church. For Mary, this wasn't just about personal belief. It was about her right as a queen to restore order, and in her mind, that meant restoring Catholicism. But could her violent persecution of Protestants be seen as a symptom of a deeper crisis of legitimacy? The paradox here is that while Mary was fighting to restore religious unity, her methods only deepened the divide, fostering fear, hatred, and even rebellion. This led to what many call the Marian persecutions, where over 280 Protestants were executed. Was this a series of religious acts, or was Mary making a dangerous gamble to keep her throne in the face of relentless opposition? Now let's address a rare and little-known fact. Despite the scale of her persecution, Mary's actual number of executions was far smaller compared to other monarchs in Europe at the time. It's a strange fact, right? In comparison to figures like Charles V or Philip II, who oversaw countless executions across Europe, Mary's actions might not seem as extreme. But why does her story stand out so much? Protestant writers and propagandists took her actions and magnified them, crafting a vivid image of a queen who could be called Bloody Mary, a name that stuck. But here's another controversial point. Historians argue that much of Mary's perceived cruelty is not a reflection of her true personality, but a result of the political and religious chaos she inherited. You might not agree with this interpretation, but consider this. When Mary ascended the throne, she was thrust into a precarious position. With her father's division of the church, the looming Protestant Reformation, and her own personal insecurities, could it be that Mary was forced into making drastic decisions just to survive? Think about it. Mary wasn't just the daughter of Henry VIII. She was a woman in a deeply patriarchal society. Her claim to the throne was constantly questioned, not only because of her gender, but also because she had spent years being declared illegitimate. Was her fierce determination to restore Catholicism a genuine fight for England's soul, or was it a desperate attempt to legitimize her rule, which had always been in doubt? It's possible that her actions were shaped not just by faith, but by the weight of her personal trauma and the political turmoil surrounding her. The country was divided, many viewed her with skepticism, and she was already struggling with the loss of her mother's influence. So, perhaps it wasn't just about Catholicism, it was about making sure she wasn't seen as weak or ineffective in the eyes of her subjects. But let's not be naive. Her reliance on religious purges to solidify her power led to far-reaching consequences. The brutal execution of Protestants, whether justified in her mind or not, alienated large swathes of her population. This created the foundation for her reputation as Bloody Mary, a name that history has clung to. The question becomes, could she have achieved the same goal of religious unity without resorting to such extreme measures? Could she have been remembered differently if she had adopted a more conciliatory approach? At this point, we have to grapple with another uncomfortable reality. History is often written by the victors, and in this case, Protestant writers were quick to paint Mary as a villainous figure. It's easy to say that Mary was a cruel monarch when you only hear one side of the story, but when we look deeper, we start to see a monarch who, despite her harsh methods, was caught in an era where religious wars and conflicts were tearing apart much of Europe. The question isn't whether Mary was wrong to execute those she saw as threats to Catholicism, but whether there was any other way for her to hold on to power in such a divided time. And here's where it gets fascinating. Despite everything, Mary's reign was also also marked by moments of real governance. She reformed the legal system, sought peace with France, and even restored certain royal traditions that helped stabilize England. In fact, some historians suggest that, had she lived longer, Mary might have been able to achieve more than what history has given her credit for. Mary's legacy, then, is much more than just Bloody Mary. It's a tragic story of a woman who fought desperately to make her reign legitimate in a time of unprecedented religious and political upheaval. Her reputation has been shaped by years of distortion, but by looking beyond the surface, we begin to see a more complex figure, a monarch who wasn't just fighting to restore her faith, but to reclaim the throne that was rightfully hers. At the end of the day, the true story of Mary asks us to question how history shapes the legacies of female leaders. Can we separate the myths and narratives from the truth? Can we see beyond the blood and betrayal to understand the motivations behind her actions? Mary's reign wasn't just about religious wars or power struggles. It was about a woman trying to carve out a space for herself in a world that wanted to keep her down. And perhaps that, in itself, is the greatest tragedy of all. Can we separate the legend of Bloody Mary from the real woman who ruled? The name Bloody Mary often brings to mind a tyrannical queen whose reign was drenched in the blood of Protestant martyrs. But is this the full story of Mary, I of England? Or is it a distortion shaped by those who opposed her? When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, she found herself in a country divided by religious conflict and political instability. She was determined to restore Catholicism, which had been violently rejected by her father, Henry VIII, and his son, Edward VI. But in her quest to return England to the Catholic fold, Mary's actions and the way history remembers them are far more complicated. Most of us know Mary as Bloody Mary, a title handed down through generations. But let's take a moment to look beyond the sensationalized image. The Marian persecutions, during which hundreds of Protestants were executed, played a huge role in the formation of her bloodthirsty reputation. But here's something that's rarely acknowledged. Mary was not the first or the only monarch in Europe to employ violence in the name of religion. In fact, when compared to other rulers of her time, the number of executions under her reign seems almost modest. This strange truth leads us to question, why did Mary become the iconic symbol of ruthless repression when so many other rulers have escaped such labels? So what's the real story behind the name Bloody Mary? It's crucial to understand that much of her legacy was shaped by the propaganda of the very people she sought to suppress. Protestant writers and historians, many of whom fled England during her reign, poured fuel on the fire of her infamous reputation. They branded her as a bloodthirsty queen without asking why she felt driven to these extreme measures. Was she just another power-hungry monarch, or was there more to her reign than a simple fight for religious dominance? One of the key factors we must consider is the context in which Mary ruled. Imagine inheriting a throne after the death of your father, knowing that your claim is shaky and that the legitimacy of your rule is constantly under threat. Now, add the fact that your reign begins with a country still reeling from the bitter consequences of your father's break from the Catholic Church. Mary's deep-rooted faith in Catholicism wasn't just about personal belief. It was her weapon to fight back against those who saw her as illegitimate. Her violent crackdown on Protestantism wasn't just about punishing dissent. It was about reasserting her authority as a legitimate ruler in a kingdom that had been torn apart by religious upheaval. Here's the most fascinating and controversial part. While Mary's persecution of Protestants was fueled by her desire to restore Catholicism, it was also a reaction to the very personal and political crisis she faced. Her entire life was marked by the trauma of being declared illegitimate after her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside by Henry VIII. This event shaped her sense of self-worth and created a deep fear that, without religious unity, she would never be recognized as a legitimate monarch. Or was it about securing her place in history as a legitimate ruler? The question, was Mary a tyrant, depends on how we view the balance of power, religion, and personal insecurities. The answer isn't simple. Some historians argue that Mary's actions were driven by personal loss and a desperate need to affirm her right to rule. And interestingly, this personal drive may have led her to overcompensate in the face of constant political challenges. Most of us know about the Marian persecutions, but fewer are aware that she was the first female monarch in English history to rule in her own right, and she faced immense pressure to prove herself not only as a ruler, but as a Catholic champion. Was her so-called bloodthirstiness a reflection of her fear, rather than sheer malice? It's true that Mary's reign was violent, but it was not unique. The executions of Protestants during her reign were part of a broader religious struggle across Europe. Other Catholic monarchs, such as Philip II of Spain, her husband, also engaged in similar violence. What sets Mary apart, however, is that her methods were so public and so politically significant in the wake of England's break with Rome. But how much of this violence was driven by a sense of duty and fear of losing her throne? How much of it was a queen desperate to restore her faith? And how much was it about protecting a legacy that had been violently uprooted? Now let's uncover a strange fact. Despite the brutal executions that marked her reign, some of Mary's contemporaries saw her as a monarch with compassion. One of her first acts upon assuming the throne was to repeal the harsh laws introduced by her brother, Edward VI. In some respects, her reign was a return to stability after the chaos of Edward's religious reforms. In other words, while she is often remembered for her bloodshed, her reign also brought a return to order and a halt defaulting of the extreme policies of her predecessors. As we look deeper into Mary's reign, we find that her actions were far more complex than the bloody narrative suggests. Was she truly a tyrant? Or was she a product of a time that left her with very few options? Her personal story reveals a monarch torn between power, faith, and a desperate need for legitimacy. She is often painted as a ruthless queen, but her reign is not just a story of violence. It is a reflection of the political and religious turmoil that defined her era. In the end, we must ask, how can we separate the legend from the reality of Mary's reign? The myth of Bloody Mary oversimplifies the complexity of her decisions. It reduces her reign to a series of executions without considering the full picture of why she took those drastic actions. To understand Mary the First, we must move beyond the nickname and explore the fear, the politics, and the deep personal insecurities that drove her to rule as she did. The legacy of Mary I challenges us to reconsider the way we judge female rulers throughout history. Her story is not just one of bloodshed and cruelty, but of a woman trying to assert her place in a world that would not allow her to succeed on her own terms. As we dig deeper into her life, we may come to realize that Mary was not merely a product of her time, but a monarch shaped by an incredibly complex set of forces, all of which collided during her turbulent reign. Mary I's reign may be remembered for its violence, but the true story is far more nuanced. Understanding this complexity is the key to separating the myth from the reality. And perhaps that's where we find a more fitting answer to the question of how we should remember Mary I, not as Bloody Mary, but as a queen who fought for her beliefs against insurmountable odds in a kingdom torn apart by its own divisions. Can we separate the legend of Bloody Mary from the real woman who ruled? The name Bloody Mary is notorious across history, conjuring images of a cruel and merciless queen, known for burning Protestants at the stake in her fight to restore Catholicism. But what if the truth behind this infamous title is more complex than what we've been led to believe? Mary I of England, the first woman to reign as a monarch in her own right, inherited a kingdom fractured by religious conflict, where loyalty to the crown was never a given. Her reign is often remembered for the violence she used to restore Catholicism, but was this the only driving force behind her decisions? Or was there something deeper, more personal at play? To fully understand Mary's legacy, we must look beyond the label of Bloody Mary. Historians and critics alike have painted her reign as one of cruelty and bloodshed, but how much of this is based on fact, and how much was the result of politically motivated propaganda? Protestant writers, seeking to discredit her rule, were quick to portray her as a tyrant, ensuring that the world would remember her as the queen who bathed England in blood. But was she really the bloodthirsty monarch she's been made out to be? Or was she simply a queen who fought for her faith in a violent and politically unstable era? Mary's reign was marked by political turbulence and deeply personal struggles. Her battle to restore Catholicism was not just about religion, but about reasserting her authority over a kingdom that had rejected her and her mother, Catherine of Aragon, in the most brutal way. Mary's father, Henry VIII, had split from the Catholic Church, severing England's ties with Rome and making the Protestant faith a national religion. The death of her mother, combined with the political and religious upheaval that followed, left Mary fighting for her legitimacy and her faith, often using drastic measures to reclaim both. That is show us a controversial truth. Much of what we know about Bloody Mary is based on the stories told by those who opposed her. The Marian persecutions, which resulted in the execution of hundreds of Protestants, were horrific and earned her the label of bloody. But was her motivation purely religious zeal, or was it more about power, fear, and reclaiming her right to rule as England's legitimate monarch? Most of us think of Mary as a ruler driven only by religious fervor, but the reality is more complicated. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain is often seen as another sign of her misguided policies, with many viewing the alliance as one of weakness. Philip was a Catholic king, and his presence in England only heightened fears among Protestants who saw him as a foreign oppressor. But was this marriage really as disastrous as history makes it seem? Mary's decision to marry Philip wasn't just a political move. It was a desperate attempt to restore England to its former religious unity, even if it came at the cost of her own popularity. Her marriage, and the foreign influence it represented, created an atmosphere of tension and mistrust. But was it truly a betrayal of England, or was it the only option left for a queen who sought to preserve her kingdom's faith? Now, let's explore a fact that is often overlooked. While Mary's reign was brutal, it wasn't the only violent one in history. Many European monarchs during the same period engaged in equally harsh tactics, but only Mary's name has been immortalized in the term bloody. Why is that? Could it be that Mary's violence was more politically significant? That the battles she fought were not just about religion, but about survival in a world where her very existence as a queen was threatened at every turn? Another critical factor in Mary's decision-making was the loss of her legitimacy. Growing up, Mary had always been the heir apparent, groomed for the throne, but after her mother was cast aside by Henry VIII, she was declared illegitimate. For years, Mary lived in the shadow of her father's will, always fighting to be recognized as a legitimate ruler. Her desire to restore Catholicism wasn't just a religious mission, it was a desperate attempt to prove herself worthy of the throne that had been denied her. Her persecution of Protestants, while certainly brutal, was also a message. England was hers to rule, and she would stop at nothing to ensure her reign was secure. But there's a strange paradox here. While Mary's actions were undoubtedly violent, many of her contemporaries were shocked by the scale of her religious persecutions. In truth, her policies were far from unique. Other European monarchs, such as Charles V and Philip II, engaged in similar tactics to secure their rule. But Mary's reign is often seen as exceptional in its brutality. This raises a key question. Was she merely following the patterns set by her peers, or was there something more personal at stake? Here's a rare fact that often gets lost in the discussion of Bloody Mary. Before her reign turned violent, Mary was actually popular in her early years as queen. Taking the throne, her first actions were seen as steps toward healing a divided country. She repealed the religious reforms of her brother Edward VI and reintroduced Catholicism. Her initial popularity, however, would soon be overshadowed by the violence she would use to enforce her religious policies. But was this violence inevitable, given the deeply fractured society she inherited? Or could Mary have ruled peacefully without resorting to such extreme measures? Mary's violent actions were not just about religion. They were about her survival as a queen in a kingdom full of enemies. Her reign was marked by the constant threat of rebellion, both from within England and from foreign enemies. The fear of being overthrown loomed over every decision she made, leading to swift and often brutal responses to any sign of dissent. This fear of rebellion explains much of the violence that characterized her reign. In a kingdom where her legitimacy was constantly in question, Mary had little choice but to respond aggressively to protect her rule. But what if things had gone differently? What if Mary had produced an heir? Could she have avoided the tragic outcome of her reign? Her childlessness, a source of great personal despair, played a key role in the instability of her rule. The failure to secure a Catholic heir left her legacy uncertain and her reign vulnerable to attack. And yet the prospect of a Catholic heir was a dream that eluded her throughout her life. Could her reign have been remembered differently if she had been able to fulfill the role of mother to a future monarch? As we continue to dissect Mary's legacy, one thing becomes clear. While she is often remembered for her cruelty, there is far more to her story than what the nickname Bloody Mary suggests. Her reign was a complex mix of personal loss, political maneuvering, and religious conviction. She may not have been the merciless queen history has painted her to be, but rather a woman who, in the face of overwhelming odds, tried to reclaim her throne, her faith, and her identity. At the end of the day, how should we view Mary I, the queen who fought for her beliefs at any cost, or the victim of a kingdom that refused to accept her? The truth lies somewhere in between, and the legacy of Bloody Mary is far more complicated than we've been led to believe. Understanding the complexities of Mary's reign not only gives us insight into her life, but also into the challenges faced by women in power throughout history. Her story is one of survival, faith, and a relentless pursuit of legitimacy in a world that often rejected her. How did Mary's inability to regain France shape the final years of her reign? Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, ruled a kingdom divided by religion and political turmoil. One of her chief ambitions, which became deeply intertwined with her reign, was the restoration of England's lost territories in France. The dream of reclaiming Calais, England's last stronghold in France, had been a goal for many monarchs before her. For Mary, it was not just about land. It was about restoring her country's honor, reasserting her legitimacy, and securing a Catholic future for England. But in 1558, Mary's dream would be shattered. England lost Calais to the French, marking the end of England's presence in France after over 2 centuries of occupation. For a queen whose reign was already under intense scrutiny and whose political standing was shaky, the loss of Calais was more than just a military defeat. It was a personal and public humiliation. Calais, once called England's French possession, had become a symbol of Mary's hopes for a return to greatness, and losing it was a blow she couldn't recover from. The loss of Calais dealt a crushing blow to Mary's political power. For a monarch who was trying to solidify her authority, it made her seem weak and ineffective. Her early years as queen had been marked by religious zeal and a fervent desire to undo the Protestant Reformation. But despite her persecution of Protestants and her violent efforts to restore Catholicism, she faced constant challenges. Calais, as the last vestige of English glory in France, was a critical piece of her vision. Losing it was an irreparable setback for a queen already struggling to prove her legitimacy. What's often overlooked is how much this loss reflected the broader disarray of Mary's reign. While Mary's reign is often remembered for its religious conflicts and violent persecution of Protestants, it was also a period of profound political instability. Her inability to secure a Catholic heir, combined with her deep desire to regain a piece of England's glory in France, meant she was fighting on multiple fronts. Her pursuit of military victory in France was tied not just to territorial ambitions, but also to her need for personal vindication and political survival. After Calais fell, Mary's reign lost much of its momentum. It's easy to think of Mary's reign as simply a religious conflict or as a period of violent retribution, but the reality is that the loss of Calais marked a turning point for Mary, one that made the failure of her plans painfully evident. This loss exacerbated Mary's already fragile mental state. She was a queen who had faced rejection and political defeat throughout her life, first from her father, then from her brother, and now as queen from her own people. Calais was supposed to be her triumph, the final piece in her effort to reassert England's Catholic identity. Instead, it became a symbol of her failure, both as a monarch and as a woman struggling to fulfill her own legacy. Mary's response to the loss of Calais was one of despair. She was devastated devastated by the news, and her health rapidly declined. Historians speculate that the loss of Calais further deepened her paranoia, which had already been fueled by her failure to produce a Catholic heir. The psychological toll was evident in the way she withdrew from public life after the defeat. Calais wasn't just a geopolitical loss, it was a blow to Mary's very identity as a monarch. She had hoped to leave a lasting legacy of strength and triumph, but instead, she found herself presiding over a nation that had been humiliated, its last claim to French soil lost. But the question remains, could Mary have done more to protect Calais? Would a different approach to diplomacy or military strategy have allowed her to retain the territory? The loss of Calais, while tragic for Mary, might also reflect the larger challenges of her reign. Challenges that were not solely due to her decisions, but were also shaped by the tumultuous era in which she ruled. The Protestant Reformation had already divided Europe, and England's place in that world was uncertain. Now, Mary's attempts to restore Catholicism were deeply tied to her desire to secure England's position on the European stage, but her failure to achieve both a military victory and religious unity left her vulnerable to criticism and defeat. Moreover, the loss of Calais set the stage for Mary's eventual downfall. The territory had been symbolic of English power, and its loss served as a reminder that Mary's ambitions could not overcome the weight of political and military realities. Her dream of restoring England's glory faded, and her legacy became increasingly defined by the religious persecution she instigated and her failure to secure a Catholic heir. Yet, there's a lesser-known twist in this story. The loss of Calais wasn't just a failure for Mary, but also for her successor, Elizabeth of France. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne, she inherited a nation that had been left vulnerable, not just by the loss of Calais, but by the ongoing religious and political strife. Elizabeth would struggle to maintain her kingdom's stability and redefine England's place in the world, but the shadow of Calais loomed large over her reign as well. Interestingly, despite the painful loss of Calais, the territory's significance to English history gradually diminished. While the loss of such a symbol was devastating at the time, it eventually became more of a historical footnote, overshadowed by the long reign of Elizabeth I, whose successes would help heal the wounds caused by Mary's reign. Calais remained important in the collective memory, but not in the way Mary had hoped. As we reflect on this chapter of Mary's reign, we see a queen who fought for a vision that was bigger than her individual struggles. While she is often remembered for her violent attempts to restore Catholicism, the loss of Calais exposes a different side of Mary. It shows a ruler who sought not just to impose her faith on her people, but also to protect and elevate her nation in a deeply divided Europe. But ultimately, her failure to regain France and her inability to protect what remained of England's power on the continent marked the beginning of the end for her reign. How did Mary's struggle with childlessness affect her reign and legacy? Mary's failure to produce an heir remains one of the most personal and politically damaging aspects of her reign. Throughout her rule, Mary desperately sought to secure a Catholic successor, hoping to ensure the continuation of her vision for England, a vision where Catholicism was restored and the nation's religious divisions healed. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, one of the most contentious political unions in English history, was supposed to be the key to this. But as the years passed, Mary faced an agonizing truth she was unable to conceive. This struggle for motherhood wasn't just a private sorrow. For Mary, it was the deepest wound to her sense of power and purpose. She was a queen, but a queen without an heir, a failure in the eyes of the court, the people, and the broader political community. The pressure on her to produce an heir was immense. In medieval and early modern England, the role of a monarch was intimately tied to their ability to produce heirs to secure the throne and preserve the dynasty. Without a child to inherit her crown, Mary's reign was seen as incomplete, even illegitimate. Her legitimacy was constantly questioned, and every year without a child only deepened the anxiety surrounding her reign. Childlessness was not just a personal issue, it was a political crisis. Her marriage to Philip, which had already alienated large portions of the English population, became a symbol of her failure. The idea of a foreign king ruling over England, combined with the increasingly clear evidence that Mary could not secure an heir, caused unrest within the court. This sense of doom worsened when, after a series of false pregnancies, the queen's hopes dwindled. In a deeply Catholic society, the failure to produce an heir was seen as a sign of divine displeasure, and many began to speculate that Mary's inability to conceive was part of a larger cosmic judgment against her reign. Historians have long debated how much Mary's childlessness influenced her decisions and policies. Some argue that her desperation to produce an heir became a driving force behind her harsher policies and religious persecution. Others suggest that Mary's fixation on pregnancy and motherhood was symptomatic of a deeper political crisis. If she couldn't secure an heir, would her religious reforms, the bloody Marian persecutions, and her attempts to undo her father's Protestant legacy hold? Would she be able to claim her place in history? These insecurities led to a brutal crackdown on dissent, particularly targeting Protestants, whom Mary saw as enemies not just of her faith, but of her rule itself. The cruel irony, however, is that her religious persecution, though meant to cement her Catholic legacy, only further tarnished her reputation. The Marian persecutions, those infamous executions of Protestant reformers, were, in part, a response to Mary's insecurity. These brutal acts were meant to show that she was in control, that she had the strength strength to restore Catholicism, but they only deepened the divisions within England. Many viewed her actions as a desperate attempt to assert her power, rather than a divine mission to restore England to its religious roots. And with each passing year, her inability to bear an heir overshadowed any religious or political triumphs. Mary's psychological state became increasingly fragile. She had not only failed as a queen to fulfill the basic requirement of securing the throne, but had also failed as a woman. The constant struggle with the idea of not being able to produce an heir led to serious doubts about her own self-worth. Could she have ruled more effectively if she had succeeded in this fundamental duty? Could she have avoided the violent backlash if she had simply been able to secure her line? In a rare and tragic twist, Mary's struggles were compounded by the public's growing fear that her reign was a passing moment, a brief chapter in England's history that would not last long enough to leave a lasting mark. The more she tried to force a Catholic revival, the more it seemed that England was slipping away from her grasp. And when she eventually died without a Catholic heir, the country turned to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth to restore order and unity. Mary's inability to have a child profoundly altered her legacy. Her reign, which many consider a failure, might have been seen in a different light if she'd been able to secure a Catholic heir. She might have been remembered as a queen who restored England's rightful faith, leaving a dynasty that would rule for generations. But instead, her inability to produce an heir left a vacuum that was quickly filled by Elizabeth. And in many ways, Elizabeth became the counterpoint to Mary's legacy. Where Mary's reign was defined by fear and repression, Elizabeth's was characterized by stability and religious compromise. The story of Mary's struggle with childlessness highlights a paradox in her reign. The one thing that she could not control, her body, was the one thing that determined whether her vision for England would be fulfilled. Had she succeeded in bearing an heir, would her reign have been remembered as a success, despite the violence of the Marian persecutions? Would England have remained firmly Catholic, and would her place in history have been more secure? Unfortunately for Mary, her inability to provide a Catholic heir sealed her fate. Her reign became a footnote in England's history, overshadowed by Elizabeth's long and successful rule. But Mary's struggle remains a poignant reminder of the immense pressures placed on rulers, especially female rulers, and the ways in which personal failure can intertwine with political crisis. What impact did Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain have on her reign? Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain remains one of the most controversial and debated aspects of her reign. To understand the true impact of this union, we must first consider the political, religious, and personal factors that influenced this decision. While it's often viewed through the lens of a power struggle between two European monarchs, the reality is far more complex. When Mary ascended to the throne in 1553, she inherited a kingdom that was fractured by religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation had torn through Europe, and England was deeply divided between the Catholics who remained loyal to Rome and the growing Protestant faction. Mary, a devout Catholic, saw the restoration of Catholicism as her divine duty. However, her legitimacy as queen was constantly questioned, not only because of her gender, but because of the circumstances surrounding her succession. This was a woman who desperately sought to solidify her rule and preserve Catholicism. A marriage to Philip, the Catholic King of Spain, seemed like the perfect solution to both her personal and political dilemmas. But it didn't take long for Mary's marriage to Philip to become a point of contention. For one, Philip was a foreign king. In the eyes of many Englishmen, Mary's marriage to a Spanish prince represented the growing power of Catholicism and a loss of England's independence. Philip's foreignness became a symbol of the political and religious control Spain might have over England, a fear that intensified as he spent more time in the country. The public's resistance to this union was palpable. Philip, who had inherited Spain's immense empire, was widely disliked in England. He was seen as a distant and aloof ruler, more interested in his own dynastic ambitions than in the well-being of the English people. His presence in England, which was part of a broader strategy to solidify Catholic control, was anything but welcome. To make matters worse, Philip's devotion to Catholicism, though aligning with Mary's goals, made their marriage even more uncomfortable for Protestants and the general population, who feared the return of religious persecution. What's often overlooked in discussions of this marriage is Mary's personal feelings toward Philip. This wasn't simply a political marriage. Mary's love for Philip was genuine, despite the coldness he often exhibited toward her. Philip, as a king, understood the strategic value of the union, but as a husband he was distant and indifferent. This lack of emotional support from Philip exacerbated Mary's struggles. Her failure to secure an heir from him, despite her desperate attempts, added to her personal frustration, causing her political instability and eventual paranoia. One strange fact that many overlook is that Mary's marriage to Philip was so unpopular that it led to several uprisings against her rule, the most notable being Wyatt's Rebellion in 1554. This rebellion was in part a reaction to the marriage. Protestant and anti-Spanish sentiments fueled the uprisings, making Philip a convenient scapegoat for much of England's discontent. The rebellion was crushed, but its legacy was clear. Mary's rule was under constant threat, and her foreign marriage had become a symbol of England's vulnerability. Despite the growing tensions surrounding their marriage, Mary's relationship with Philip was also marked by religious zeal. Philip's presence in England was meant to solidify Catholic control, and the two worked together to reverse the Protestant Reformation that had taken root under her father, Henry VIII, and her brother, Edward VI. Yet the alliance between them was also seen as a vehicle for Philip's ambitions. As a Catholic monarch, Philip's influence grew, and many feared that Mary was not simply marrying a man she loved, but also aligning herself with a foreign power that would dictate the future of England. This brings us to the most significant impact of Mary's marriage, her drive to restore Catholicism to England. Philip was central to her ambitions, but his influence also led to some of the darkest chapters of her reign, the Marian persecutions. The marriage provided the backing for Mary's quest to reinstate Catholic practices, even if it meant executing hundreds of Protestants. Historians debate whether this persecution was driven solely by religious zeal, or if it was Mary's attempt to assert her own legitimacy in a kingdom that saw her as a weak monarch. The violent actions against Protestants were in part a way for Mary to demonstrate her power and legitimacy, but it was also the realization of her marriage's political purpose. One of the most controversial aspects of this marriage is the degree to which it became a political liability. Philip's prolonged absence from England caused the public to view the union as increasingly futile. He had no real interest in ruling England, and his own religious and political agendas were more important than his wife's. As Mary grew older and more frail, she became desperate for an heir. Her inability to conceive only worsened the perception that the marriage had failed. Philip's role in her reign was reduced, and after her death, England found itself in a much stronger position under the rule of her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth I. Interestingly, Philip's legacy in England was shaped by his marriage to Mary. While their union was seen as an unmitigated disaster by many, it marked a turning point in England's history. It pushed the country into the Protestant camp once and for all, largely because of the political and religious consequences of Mary's rule. Philip's influence may have been short-lived, but it left behind a nation irrevocably changed by the dynastic struggles that surrounded his marriage to Mary. In the end, the legacy of Philip II's marriage to Mary is one of political miscalculations, personal disappointment, and religious conflict. What Mary believed would be a triumphant return of Catholicism, backed by a powerful Spanish king, ultimately became the undoing of her reign. Her personal hopes, intertwined with the political realities of her time, left a legacy marked by division, death, and the bitter consequences of royal ambitions. Despite these setbacks, there's a lingering question. If Mary had not married Philip, would England have experienced the same level of religious conflict? Would her reign have been remembered differently? Would the history of England have taken an entirely different course? These questions remain unanswered, but what's clear is that the marriage, while unsuccessful, irrevocably altered the course of history and left behind a legacy far more complex than the Bloody Mary legend suggests. What was the lasting effect of Mary's childlessness on her reign and legacy? Mary's desperate desire for a child with Philip II was not just a personal longing, it was the central focus of her reign. In many ways, her inability to produce an heir shaped her decisions as queen and determined her place in history. But was her childlessness the result of fate, or could it have been the catalyst for the end of her dreams of restoring Catholicism to England? Mary's struggle to conceive was not just an emotional burden, but a political disaster. As a Catholic monarch, her primary aim was to ensure the continuation of her faith through her children, ensuring that England would remain a Catholic nation even after her death. The lack of an heir jeopardized that dream and led to intense political instability. If she had been able to give birth to a child, perhaps a Catholic heir, the course of English history could have been drastically different. However, instead of the continuity she so desperately sought, she was left to rule a kingdom that viewed her marriage and childlessness as a source of weakness. First, there's the question of Mary's legacy. Most monarchs, especially women, were judged by their ability to provide a successor. Mary's inability to do so marked her as a failure in the eyes of many, both within England and abroad. Imagine the pressure she must have felt, a queen who could not fulfill her primary duty, and a Catholic queen in a Protestant-dominated world, facing constant scrutiny for the very act of ruling. What's rarely talked about, though, is the emotional toll Mary's childlessness took on her. For a woman who had fought for her legitimacy and who believed deeply in her divine right to rule, the failure to produce an heir was catastrophic. Some might say it was a sign of fate, while others argue it was the result of medical conditions beyond her control. A possibility that Mary may have been suffering from an underlying physical ailment, such as a tumor or hormonal imbalance, has been proposed by historians. One strange fact that often goes unmentioned is that Mary's symptoms were actually consistent with menopause, despite her relatively young age. Was this the cruel hand of fate, or a physical manifestation of her political struggle? Mary's personal despair over her childlessness also had a clear political dimension. A monarch who failed to secure the line of succession would inevitably face challenges to her authority, especially in a time when a woman on the throne was already viewed with skepticism. To many, Mary's failure to provide an heir was a sign that her reign was destined to fail. This only fueled the growing sense of uncertainty within her court and among the people. Many began to question her ability to rule effectively. What kind of queen was one who could not fulfill the most basic of royal duties? Perhaps the most tragic element of this situation is that Mary's childlessness left her utterly vulnerable. Without an heir, she couldn't secure the future of her Catholic cause, and this fact weighed heavily on her. The failure to produce a child became symbolic of her political vulnerability in the context of her increasingly difficult relationship with Philip II, who was often absent from England, Mary had to face the stark reality that the throne might fall into the hands of someone who would reverse everything she had worked for. Her desperation to have a child, and the subsequent personal torment of not being able to conceive, contributed to an increased paranoia. This was especially true after false pregnancies, and the strain of trying to maintain a semblance of stability in her rule. Imagine the psychological toll, the fear that your dreams for the future, and the very future of your faith, could vanish because you couldn't provide the one thing that society demanded from you. Her mental and emotional state began to deteriorate, and this only contributed to the increasingly harsh and unpredictable nature of her rule. For all the personal heartache that Mary suffered, her inability to conceive had a profound political impact. Without an heir, her throne was left vulnerable, and as time wore on, the political situation in England grew more unstable. Mary's childlessness set the stage for Elizabeth Urfai to ascend to the throne. Despite Mary's efforts to secure the succession through marriage and political alliances, the fear of what might happen after her death and the uncertainty about who would inherit the throne left England poised on the edge of a major shift in its history. It was Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, who would go on to rule as one of England's greatest monarchs, ushering in the Elizabethan era, a time of relative peace and prosperity. Had Mary been able to produce an heir, it's possible that the religious and political turmoil of the Tudor era could have continued much longer. Now, here's the controversial part. Many modern historians argue that Mary's inability to have a child was more than just a biological issue. It was a symptom of a greater crisis in her reign. Some believe that her childlessness reflected her deeper inability to unify England under a common cause. Instead of focusing on national security or fostering a sense of stability, her reign became a personal battle, one rooted in her quest for legitimacy and religious power. Perhaps in trying so hard to produce a Catholic heir, Mary overlooked the importance of securing her throne and legacy through broader political and social reforms. A rare fact that many don't consider is that Mary's tragic yearning for an heir may have also influenced her treatment of her enemies. Some historians suggest that the stress of childlessness led her to act out of fear rather than conviction, especially in her treatment of Protestants. Could her persecution of Protestants have been a desperate attempt to restore order, or was it a misguided way to compensate for her inability to ensure her succession? In conclusion, the impact of Mary's childlessness cannot be overstated. It was more than a personal disappointment. It was a political and emotional crisis that reverberated throughout her reign. It not only undermined her authority, but also directly contributed to the instability that marked her rule. Her inability to produce an heir left her vulnerable to the rise of Elizabeth I, whose reign would be seen as the successful continuation of Tudor power, albeit in a different form. The unanswered question remains: could Mary's reign have been more successful if she had fulfilled this one expectation? Would the course of English history have changed? These are questions that we may never fully answer, but they remain integral to understanding the complexities of Mary's reign and legacy. How did Mary's relationship with her half-sister Elizabeth I shape her decisions as queen, and what impact did it have on the future of England? Mary's reign was marked by a constant struggle with the legitimacy of her rule, especially considering the powerful presence of her half-sister Elizabeth I. While Mary fought for her Catholic vision and the stability of her rule, Elizabeth's Protestant influence cast a long shadow over her reign. But was Mary's intense reaction to Elizabeth's role as a Protestant monarch a sign of personal conflict, or was it driven by political necessity? The tension between Mary and Elizabeth was more than just a sibling rivalry. It was a battle for the future of England. Mary's struggle was fundamentally about the restoration of Catholicism in a country that was increasingly leaning towards Protestantism. From the moment Mary ascended to the throne, the threat of Elizabeth, a Protestant and the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, loomed large. Elizabeth represented everything that Mary sought to reverse: the religious reformations begun by her father and continued by her brother Edward VI. But it's not just the political battle that defined their relationship. There was a deeply personal element involved too. Mary was painfully aware of the widespread Protestant opposition to her reign, and Elizabeth was seen by many as a legitimate alternative to Mary's throne. Elizabeth's refusal to confirm her loyalty to the Catholic faith was seen by Mary as a direct challenge to her reign. This dynamic was not just about religion. It was about power, legacy, and the fear of being overthrown. What's more interesting is how this rivalry may have shaped Mary's policies. In her efforts to restore Catholicism, Mary sought to solidify her power by eliminating Protestant influences within her court and throughout England. This wasn't just a matter of religious zeal, it was a matter of survival. The Marian persecutions, where hundreds of Protestants were executed, are often seen as Mary's attempt to secure her throne, to protect her vision for England, and to rid the country of the influence of those who would threaten her legitimacy. But here's the controversial part. Some historians argue that Mary's actions weren't just about restoring Catholicism. They were also about eradicating a potential rival, her own half-sister. Could it be that the extreme measures Mary took were driven as much by personal animosity and fear of Elizabeth's future threat as by genuine religious fervor? Many would argue that the executions were not solely an act of religious righteousness, but a reflection of Mary's desperation to eliminate any challenges to her throne, including Elizabeth. One rarely discussed fact is the sheer scale of the threat Elizabeth posed to Mary's rule. Despite being being declared illegitimate by her father, Elizabeth had the support of a large faction of Protestants in England. While Mary was desperate to solidify her legitimacy through marriage and the production of an heir, Elizabeth's status as the rightful Protestant heir was never truly contested by the public. The question then becomes, if Mary's persecution of Protestants was primarily motivated by her faith, why did she not extend similar measures to Elizabeth herself? It's clear that Mary feared Elizabeth's potential as the next monarch of England. Was it simply that Mary couldn't bring herself to execute her half-sister, or was there something more politically savvy in her hesitation? And there's the problem. While Mary was trying to secure her throne through the persecution of Protestant reformers, her failure to deal directly with Elizabeth allowed the Protestant cause to thrive. Instead of extinguishing the Protestant threat once and for all, Mary's policies may have inadvertently heightened it. By the time Mary's reign ended, Elizabeth was free to take the throne, and the religious landscape of England had shifted beyond Mary's control. Ironically, Elizabeth's ascent to the throne solidified Protestantism in England, and the very cause Mary fought to restore was only temporarily delayed. In fact, Mary's reign, marked by its violent attempts to reclaim Catholicism, led to one of the most significant consequences in English history: the rise of Elizabeth as a Protestant monarch. Some may view Mary's reign as a failure for her inability to stamp out Protestantism, while others may see it as a tragic personal conflict shaped by her relationship with her half-sister. So what's the ultimate takeaway from Mary's complex relationship with Elizabeth? It shows how deeply personal rivalries and political ambition can intertwine. Mary's desperate need to restore Catholicism in England became inextricably linked with her fear of Elizabeth, a fear that she could never fully shake. In the end, Mary's failure to reconcile her personal animosity with the greater political realities of her reign led to the collapse of her efforts to restore Catholicism. It's a cautionary tale about how personal relationships, especially those within families, can shape the course of history. The tension between Mary and Elizabeth wasn't just about differing religious beliefs. It was about the future of England itself. While Mary's reign is often remembered for its bloody persecution of Protestants, the true tragedy may lie in how her inability to address her fears of Elizabeth ultimately led to her understanding. This relationship between Mary and Elizabeth forces us to reconsider how we view both queens in history. Could Mary have succeeded if she had not seen Elizabeth as her rival? Or was her fate sealed from the moment she ascended to the throne, destined to be defined by the rivalry that had been built between them long before either of them could claim power? This complex dynamic continues to intrigue historians. While Mary's reign ended in defeat, Elizabeth's reign ushered in an era of stability for England. The unresolved tension between the two queens offers insight into the struggles of female rulers in a male-dominated world. Mary's reign, though marked by religious fervor and harsh actions, ultimately made Elizabeth's victory and the rise of Protestantism even more pronounced, leaving us with a crucial lesson. Family ties can be just as powerful, if not more so, than any political conflict. Despite centuries of historical analysis, Mary's reign remains filled with unanswered questions. Some aspects of her rule remain mysterious, leaving us to wonder about the true motivations behind her actions. Was her reign defined by a deep, unwavering religious conviction, or were there more personal, emotional reasons behind her decisions? Silence that marked her reign a reflection of political necessity, or a desperate attempt to assert control in a time of turmoil? What if Mary's brutal suppression of Protestants was more about power than religion? Historians have long debated the true reasons behind her Marian persecutions. While some argue that Mary's religious zeal drove her actions, others suggest that her efforts to eliminate opposition were rooted in her need to maintain power. After all, Mary was a monarch in a precarious position. Her legitimacy as queen was questioned, especially since she was the daughter of a controversial marriage and ruled in an age when political and religious strife often went hand in hand. Could her violent actions have been motivated by the fear of losing everything? What about Mary's relationship with Elizabeth? The unresolved tension between these two sisters is often overlooked. The rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth was more than a political struggle. It was deeply personal, shaped by each woman's contrasting vision for England. Elizabeth, a Protestant, represented everything that Mary had fought against. Despite their shared blood, Mary's determination to maintain her throne often overshadowed her family ties. Could the animosity between the two have influenced Mary's decisions during her reign? Another question that continues to intrigue historians is how Mary viewed her legacy. Did she understand the full impact of her reign before her death, or was she blind to the consequences of her actions? Given the stark contrast between her reign and Elizabeth's subsequent rule, it's clear that Mary's legacy was complex. Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism, her failure to produce an heir, and her violent persecution of Protestants left a lasting mark on English history. But did she ever believe she would be remembered as a tyrant? Then there's the issue of gender. As one of the few female monarchs in history, Mary's reign raises significant questions about the expectations placed on women in power. Were her actions a result of the pressures placed on her as a female ruler, expected to live up to the legacy of male monarchs before her? Or was her violence, her inability to produce an heir, and her frustration with her perceived illegitimacy merely a reflection of the times she lived in? Could the history book books have been more sympathetic to her struggles as a woman in power. Despite her best efforts, Mary's reign was short-lived, and her struggles did not end with the completion of her reign. The aftermath of her decisions left an imprint on England's religious landscape and unresolved questions about her reign. Her motivations, her feelings about her legacy, and the impact of her decisions still shape how we view her today. What can we learn from these unanswered questions, and how does her story continue to captivate us? In reflecting on these aspects of her reign, we are forced to confront the complexities of Mary's rule. While Bloody Mary is a name that strikes fear, the true story of her reign is far more complicated than we may have been led to believe. She was not just a violent queen, as history often portrays her. She was a woman fighting for her throne in a world where religion, politics, and personal struggles collided. The unanswered questions about her reign invite us to reconsider the way we view women in power, both in history and today. Mary's reign, though brief and marked by bloodshed, left a legacy that is still being dissected today. By exploring the mysteries of her reign, we gain valuable insights into the challenges faced by female rulers and how their legacies can be shaped by history. Her story, filled with unanswered questions, continues to resonate and captivate us, offering important lessons about power, politics, and the complexities of history itself. By now, we've uncovered many of the truths surrounding Mary's reign, her complex motivations, the challenges she faced, and the controversies that defined her time as queen. But we're left with lingering questions. How should we interpret her legacy, especially given the mixed historical portrayals of her as Bloody Mary? Was she a tyrant, or was she a woman forced into decisions shaped by circumstances beyond her control? One of the most challenging aspects of Mary's legacy is how much of it has been shaped by history, and more specifically by her enemies. The label Bloody Mary continues to evoke fear and revulsion. But what if it was too simplistic? Or what if history misunderstood her, reducing her actions to mere cruelty and ignoring the deeper political and personal forces that guided them? Mary's reign didn't last long, and the consequences of her decisions were swift and far-reaching. Her attempts to restore Catholicism to England, her forced marriage to Philip II, and her attempts to assert her authority were undoubtedly radical. But at what cost? Her failure to leave behind a male heir, her struggles with infertility, and the loss of Calais to France all weighed heavily on her reign. They led to a deteriorating political atmosphere, one in which rebellions were a constant threat. But even more devastating was the emotional and personal toll. Her drive for legitimacy and stability constantly clashed with her deeply personal feelings of fear and insecurity. Then there's the question of her relationship with her half-sister Elizabeth. The animosity between the two was not just political, but deeply rooted in their contrasting views on religion and their struggle for control of England. Could Mary have ruled differently had Elizabeth not been a looming shadow, challenging everything Mary fought for? We'll never know for sure, but it's clear that Mary's reign was far from easy. She was torn between her religious zeal, her desire for political stability, and the emotional struggles of being a monarch in a country deeply divided. Yet, despite the challenges and the Bloody Mary label, Mary did leave behind a legacy. Historians continue to debate her impact. Was she a product of her time, or was she an outlier in a period of unprecedented change? Did her violent measures, including the Marian persecutions, stem from an unrelenting desire for religious purity, or were they a desperate attempt to consolidate power and protect her throne? Her story is complicated, and while it's tempting to reduce her reign to one of bloodshed, it's essential to understand the broader context of her act. She wasn't just a power-hungry queen. She was a woman navigating an impossible landscape, balancing her role as a Catholic monarch, a daughter seeking revenge for the betrayal of her mother, and a queen desperate to prove her right to rule. What can we learn from her reign today? First, that power is often shaped by more than just external enemies. It is also shaped by internal battles. Mary's rule is a powerful reminder of the complexities women in power face, especially in patriarchal societies. In this sense, her reign speaks volumes about the historical and gendered expectations placed on female rulers. It also underscores the importance of context. The emotional and personal challenges Mary faced as a woman in power often overshadow the political realities of her time. The struggles she endured, the trauma of being declared illegitimate, the pressure to produce a male heir, and the constant fear of rebellion are struggles that have been faced by many monarchs, male and female alike. In conclusion, Mary's reign is a testament to the deep, complex nature of leadership. While her name still echoes in history as a figure of bloodshed, the true story is far more nuanced. Understanding the forces that shaped her decisions offers valuable lessons about power, politics, and the lasting legacies left by those who rule. While Bloody Mary remains a powerful name, the real story behind it is one of a queen struggling to assert her right to rule, battling not only political foes but her own deep-seated fears and emotional burdens. As we look back on Mary's reign, we see not just a ruler, but a deeply human figure whose actions were shaped by forces both external and internal. And in understanding her struggles, we gain greater insight into the challenges faced by women in history and the legacies they leave behind. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.